Hi everyone, this is the second of two videos on the foreign policy of the Conservative governments from 1951 to 1964. In the first of these videos, we looked at the fact that Britain had emerged from the Second World War, although victorious, much weaker than in 1939. They were very much no longer a superpower. They were in the shadow of both the USA and the Soviet Union. On the other hand, there were lots of British politicians and plenty of the British public who refused to acknowledge that new reality. And we looked in that video at the way that applied to questions about whether Britain should join the EEC, now the EU. We also looked at the impact of that question on Britain's relationship with the USA as well, particularly in the developing Cold War situation. In this video, we're going to look at two further aspects of British foreign policy in this period, one of which we've touched on in a couple of previous videos, and that's the Suez crisis, and the other of which is decolonisation, the process by which Britain gradually dismantled its empire. So first of all, the Suez crisis. If you've watched the video about Conservative governments in overview, you'll remember we mentioned this as part of the Eden government. The Suez crisis, of course, was what brought Eden down. But when we look at foreign policy, we need to look at the finer details of this crisis. So this is what we're going to do now. A little bit of geography first of all. As good historians, you might be a little bit suspicious of geography, but there are times when we do need a pretty good grasp of it, and this is one of them. The map here is really important. You'll see that the Suez Canal is there as part of Egypt, and it connects the Mediterranean Sea with the Indian Ocean, and those purple arrows demonstrate a really important truth. Before the creation of the Suez Canal, if Britain was to trade with Asia and also with Australasia, with Australia and New Zealand, key parts of its trade, key parts of its empire previously, then it would have to go all the way around Africa through the Atlantic Ocean and into the Indian Ocean, and then potentially down to the Pacific as well. What you can see is that the Suez Canal allows Britain to trade via the Mediterranean Sea through the Suez Canal down the Red Sea, past the coast of Africa and Saudi Arabia, and into the Indian Ocean. And as the annotations demonstrate, that is significantly easier, significantly shorter. And so the Suez Canal had become crucial to Britain as part of its position as an imperial power, a country with an empire, and as part of its role as a key trading nation. It wasn't just Britain either. That statistic there is really quite telling, isn't it? 80% of the oil that was imported into Western Europe from Asia passes through the Suez Canal. So the Suez Canal is really very important to Britain, to France, to Western Europe. The other thing that you need to be aware of is that until 1956, from its creation in the late 19th century, the canal had been operated by a private company called the Suez Canal Company. Although Egypt has a stake in that, the majority of that company is owned by private French investors. Now, all that changes in 1956. In 1956, Colonel Nasser leads a coup. He's, as you can tell from the title, a senior member of the Egyptian army, and he leads a coup against the Egyptian monarchy. Nasser seizes power. And Nasser is a nationalist. By that, we mean he's supportive of decolonisation movements across Africa and Asia. Nasser is very hostile to the traditional European empires, not least the British and the French. And not surprisingly, Nasser's rhetoric towards Western Europe very much worries Britain. And so Britain and America made the decision to pull out of a project which they had considered investing in quite heavily. That was the project to build what we call the Aswan Dam in Egypt. So all of a sudden, NASA doesn't have that British and American investment in his project. He needs to raise funds and finance in order that Egypt can go ahead with that project, a really crucial project for that country. And so how does NASA do it? Well, he does it by nationalising the Suez Canal Company. In other words, Egypt takes full control of the Suez Canal and is able to profit from that. And Britain and France are horrified. The idea that this new Egyptian president, who Britain in particular sees as an evil dictator, now has full control of this canal which is so important to Britain's trade, so important to the British Empire, that horrifies Britain and France as well. Britain, of course, is worried that NASA will cut off British trade, will stop Britain being able to use the canal for its trade. Remember that 80% of Western European oil import statistic. Cutting off trade via the canal would have a massive impact on Britain and on France. By doing something which is so clearly intended to antagonise and provoke Western Europe, NASA's doing something which is clearly anti-Western. Now, at the time, 10, 11 years into the Cold War, if you're doing something anti-Western Europe, by definition, you're doing something hostile to that side of the Cold War. And all of a sudden, the implication seems to be, is NASA going to go and support the USSR? So not only is NASA threatening the empire, not only is NASA threatening British trade, but NASA as well may well be on his way to supporting the enemy, the other side, in the Cold War. So for all of those reasons, Eden believes he's going to have to do something in Suez. And there's even more. Eden is one of these people who's not fully accepted Britain's changing role in the world. Eden believes, as Churchill does, that Britain remains a leading empire, it's a leading power, and how dare NASA do something to threaten that status? And to fully understand Eden and his motivations, you've got to go back to the 1930s. Eden and Churchill had been two of the leading voices who'd criticised what we call the appeasement of Hitler. If you've looked at the 30s and the rise of Nazi Germany and the descent of Europe into World War II, you may well know about appeasement. If you don't, appeasement was the idea that if we allow Hitler some of what he wants in terms of land in Eastern Europe, then ultimately it will stop him being too aggressive. Neville Chamberlain, who was British Prime Minister in the late 30s, very much put forward the policy of appeasement for understandable reasons. Who wanted another horrific world war like World War One? And it's easy to judge with hindsight, Chamberlain, but appeasement had its merits at the time. Nevertheless, Eden had been a very strong voice against appeasement. Eden believed in stopping dictators, and as far as Eden was concerned, NASA was a dictator in the Hitler mould, and Eden believed NASA was evil, Eden believed NASA was dangerous, and Eden would stop at almost nothing if that meant that NASA could be curtailed. And that's where we get the Suez plot. As we've said, it's not just Britain who are concerned about NASA, it's France as well. And it's also Israel. This is where we're into Middle Eastern politics as well. Israel and Egypt had a very hostile relationship, and NASA, as a particularly outspoken Egyptian leader, was especially anti-Israeli. And so the plot, when it comes, involves not just Britain and France, but Israel as well. The three countries meet secretly at Sèvres near Paris and come up with a plan. And crucially, Eden does not inform Parliament, nor does he inform the USA. The seeds of his downfall are already being sown. The plan's a pretty simple one. Israel would invade Egypt. Britain and France would go, oh my goodness, Israel's invaded Egypt. We need to intervene. We need to impose peace. We need to separate these warring factions and come in as the good guys and impose peace. That's the official reason that's going to be used. The reality, of course, is that Britain and France will intervene, and as part of that intervention, they will seize control of the Suez Canal. Nice, straightforward plan. In theory, it doesn't work in practice. It's not because of military problems. Now, it is true that on a military level, things don't go entirely as planned. There are hiccups. But ultimately, on a military level alone, the plan, once it was put into effect at the end of October 56, probably would have succeeded. It's true as well that once the plan was put into effect, even without knowing the secret details, there were people in Britain who said, look, we shouldn't be doing this. There were anti-war protesters out on the streets. The Labour Party, from the beginning, opposed what Eden had done. And a good chunk of the British public were against British intervention as well. But again, would that have been enough to stop Eden? Probably not. The crucial factor here, which ultimately leads to Eden having to halt military intervention, ultimately leads to the plot ending, ultimately leads to Eden's downfall. The crucial factor here is the intervention of the United States. And on a really simple level, by US intervention, we mean the fact that President Eisenhower says to Britain, you have behaved extremely badly. The US is appalled by what Britain and France and Israel have done, by the secrecy of it, by the deviousness of it, and also by the fact that they have been kept out of the loop. The US is not used to being sidelined. So for all those reasons, the US makes it very clear to Britain, we do not like what you've done, and moreover, we demand that you call an immediate ceasefire. This needs to end now. And it becomes clear pretty quickly to Britain that they're going to have to do what the US has told them. There's a lot of economic pressure in particular from the US. Britain, not surprisingly, is already suffering. The canal's being closed, and as we know, the oil supply is crucial, through the canal, and that's damaging the supply of oil already that's coming into Britain. Britain's struggling. Britain goes to the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and says we need a loan. Our economy is in danger. And the US says to the IMF, no, we are not giving Britain a loan. They have behaved very badly. Things go from bad to worse. Saudi Arabia, really big oil producer, puts in place an oil embargo. In other words, they stop selling oil to Britain, and Britain says to the US, we need oil. Give us oil, please, to compensate for this. And the US says, no, we are not going to help you out. You are the bad guys in this situation. If you want our help, you need to stop. You need to call a ceasefire, and you need to withdraw your troops from Suez. Eden really doesn't like this pressure from the US. Eden would really rather continue, but under pressure from Macmillan in particular, he realises he's got no choice. Macmillan's an interesting one. Macmillan had been one of the biggest supporters of the plot, but he's also one of the first people to wake up and realise that it can't continue. And he says very clearly to Eden, the game is up. Doesn't stop Macmillan, of course, from becoming Prime Minister after Eden, despite his support for the invasion, but it's certainly the case that Macmillan is quick to realise political reality here. And so the Suez plot is over. Now, the impact of the Suez crisis is really important to understand in all sorts of ways. If you've watched previous videos, the first couple of points should be familiar to you. First of all, it's the end of Eden's political career. The massive irony about Suez is that Eden's always been seen as a foreign policy specialist. One of the biggest criticisms in the early part of his time as Prime Minister was that Eden didn't really seem that interested or that good at domestic and economic policy because he was too interested in foreign policy. But actually, ultimately, it's foreign policy that causes his downfall. The fact that he's not told Parliament the truth, he's withheld details of the plan from Parliament, that's really damaging. It's not how a Prime Minister should be behaving. all of that ultimately leads to Eden's resignation and retirement as Prime Minister early in 1957, and to the rise of Macmillan. If you watch the videos on social change, you'll know that in the 50s and 60s, although the establishment remains strong, its reputation is just beginning to come into question and under fire, and Suez is an early part of that. Things like the Profumo affair, of course, in the 60s, just add to this idea that the establishment is corrupt and dishonest, but Suez has played a role in that. Eden's government has lied, Eden's government has covered up the truth, and Eden's government has desperately tried to continue with the plot. And there is the question, had it not been for US pressure, would Eden have carried on? Probably he would. All of this makes the establishment look corrupt. But of course, this is very much about foreign policy, this video, and it's about foreign policy that we're looking at in points 3 and 4. Britain, particularly during the Second World War, very much liked to portray itself as a force for good in the world, with the defeat of Nazi Germany and the Japanese Empire. Much harder now for Britain to say it's a force for good. Britain has been plotting, Britain has been behaving very badly. Point 4, perhaps the most important of all now, Suez, perhaps more than any other event, shows that those politicians and those people who like to pretend Britain is still a superpower are wrong. The US has forced into a ceasefire. It's clear that on an economic level, on a military level, it's the US, not Britain, which is the Western superpower. And increasingly, if Britain is going to play a major role in world events, particularly in the Cold War, it will have to be by tying its foreign policy to the USA in that special relationship that we've talked about before. But of course, in that special relationship, Britain is very much not the dominant partner. The other big issue, which shows that Britain is no longer a superpower, is the fact that in the 50s and in the 60s, we see the end of the British Empire, the process that we know as decolonisation. Now, this has begun actually during the Attlee government. In 1947, the British withdraw from India. India used to be called the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. So that in itself had been a major step towards decolonisation. But nevertheless, as we move into the 50s, the British Empire is still extremely big, covers quite a bit of Africa, places in Europe even, such as Cyprus, places in Southeast Asia like Malaya. So the British Empire remains a significant force, but it's also true that in many of those places, like Cyprus and Malaya, by the 50s, there are strong movements fighting for independence. And by fighting, we mean literally fighting as well. British troops are having to head off rebellions in several of the British colonies. Now, Churchill, in the early 50s, who is a fan of the empire, Churchill is very, very reluctant to decolonise. He accepts it's going to have to happen, but he believes it can be done gradually. It's a gradual transition from the empire to this new Commonwealth, and he's sure that's possible. Churchill's view is that yes, there are these independence movements, but actually most of the people of those countries, they're not quite ready for independence. They don't necessarily believe in it, and you know, we're not entirely sure that they're civilized enough. You know, Churchill is living in fantasy land here for all sorts of reasons, but he believes this. He believes, look, for a few years we will use the army to quell these rebellions, to deal with the resistance movements, to contain them, and then eventually when the people of those countries are ready for independence, then we will allow it. Now, when Churchill puts this into practice in Kenya in 1952, it's already clear that it's not going to work. In Kenya, there's a particularly violent rebellion by a group called the Mau Mau, led by Jomo Kenyatta, who ends up finally running the country. But at this stage, the British Army is trying to head the rebellion off in line with Churchill's policy. But they're struggling. Not only are they struggling, there's all sorts of allegations of terrible atrocities being committed by the British Army, particularly at a prison camp in Hull. And so again, Britain's moral reputation is being damaged, and on a practical level, they're struggling to contain this uprising. It's clear that Churchill's policy of gradual transition can't really be sustained. And once again, a bit like with Suez, it's Macmillan who's the one who realises this. Macmillan looks back to the Suez crisis and the fact that Britain is no longer a world power. Macmillan looks at Kenya and the fact that the Mau Mau have really taken on the British Army, and Macmillan thinks we're actually going to have to change policy here. Decolonisation is a reality and we need to speed it up. Very famous speech in 1960 that Macmillan makes in Cape Town in South Africa, and he uses this really powerful phrase. He says, "The winds of change are blowing across the African continent." This is the moment more than any other where these Conservative governments acknowledge that decolonisation is happening and that it needs to be allowed to happen at a quicker pace as well. Macmillan has two main hopes when it comes to decolonisation. First of all, he's clear that these newly independent countries need to allow black majority rule. As part of colonisation, white settlers had been sent to pretty much all of these countries. They're generally in the minority. And Macmillan's clear that that white minority in each of these countries should not try and cling on to power, that the African majority has to be allowed to govern those independent countries. The example, of course, of a country which very much defies that and goes against it, and already is by this stage, is South Africa with its terrible racist system of apartheid. But Macmillan hopes that South Africa will not be the model for those other countries. Of course, we're in the Cold War as well, and Macmillan's other great hope is that those newly independent countries will be very much a friendly part of the Commonwealth, and that they will join, as Macmillan sees it, a family of westernised capitalist democracies, rather than taking the Soviet side when it comes to the Cold War. But crucially, Macmillan's view is independence is a reality, the days of empire are coming to an end, and we have to do what we can to speed up that process to make it as peaceful and orderly as possible. And largely speaking, that's what happens. You can see lots of different examples there of countries that become independent from the British Empire. In the Macmillan era, Ghana, first of all, in West Africa, Nigeria also in West Africa, Cyprus in the Mediterranean. All of those have become independent by 1960. Yet more African countries in 61, 62, 63, Tanganyika, Sierra Leone, Uganda, and finally Kenya, home of the Mau Mau in 1963. And despite Macmillan's acknowledgement that decolonisation should be orderly, should be quick, it's still, of course, a difficult process. But it is worth noting that by breaking with Churchill's attitudes, by adopting a more progressive approach, Macmillan ensures that the British experience of decolonisation is less violent and quicker as well than the experience of quite a lot of other European empires. We don't generally see the level of bloodshed that we saw with Portugal, with Belgium, and particularly with France, where if you look at the French withdrawal from Algeria, it's a hugely violent and a hugely bloody event. And so by the end of this period of Conservative government, we've got a very different Britain to the one that we began the period with in terms of foreign policy. A Britain that no longer has the empire that was such an important part of policy even for Churchill. A Britain that gradually is finally beginning to recognise that it's no longer a superpower. A Britain that's very much tied to the US as the junior partner in the special relationship. A Britain that's realised that joining the EEC would be a positive thing, but that's been denied that opportunity by de Gaulle.
Hi everybody, huge thank you there to Tom. Really interesting video looking at the Suez crisis and decolonisation. Really important stage in British foreign policy. So this video follows on from Tom's earlier video that looked at the Cold War, Britain's relationship with the European community, and the idea of a nuclear deterrent. And we're continuing to build our way through the specification, and it's really important, if you want to find out more of this as you come in and know when these videos appear, to make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. And as we add on this topic and on others, you'll get notified as those go in. We're also adding videos on Tsarist Russia and other history topics such as the Tudors. And there's also a whole range of A-level politics videos. So check out those as well if you're interested in politics, particularly stuff going on about the American election and all that kind of stuff at the moment. Hope you've enjoyed it. Leave some comments for Tom and hit like if you found it helpful. Thank you very much for watching.